What will the Denver Broncos 53-man roster look like? Sayre, Bedinger, and myself, we're going to break it down, preview, project, and predict what we think the 53-man roster will be. You're going to get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
The Denver Broncos are set to begin their 53-man roster cut down at any point. They may have already gotten started as we're doing the show, but welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Special shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content coverage, analysis, and more. You get that every single day, all year long here on the podcast. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Sayre, this is the fun part here in terms of the mental gymnastics you and I have had to go through to formulate in our heads the 53-man roster. Going from 90 to 53 is tough. I want to preface this by saying that as we're sitting down recording this, the only move the Broncos have made so far was moving on from Nick Williams, cutting and waiving him from the team, and he maybe could be a practice squad player down the line. We'll see, but as the time we're doing this on Sunday afternoon, this is the only thing that has happened. So this may or not change as we get a little bit longer here into Monday if you're tuning in or listening or watching there. But going through here, Sayre, let's take a look at the Broncos offense. And you and I are going to have kind of formulated this whole entire 53-man roster. I've got them keeping 23 players on the offensive side, and I think some is contingent upon, okay, get to your 53, maybe make some roster moves if there's some guys dealing with injuries, and then see who you can bring up onto your active. There's so many different things in play here, but I say let's tackle the easy ones first here. I'd say quarterback, two of them. Do you agree with me? I've got Russ and I've got Jarrett Stidham.
I do agree with that, Cody. I really do. And it's nothing against Ben DiNucci. I just think the Broncos are going to have to allocate roster spots elsewhere. And I think the third quarterback kind of stipulation that the NFL has put in for this season and going forward is really going to have to be looked at kind of later on, or maybe on an as needed basis. Like if the Broncos had traded for Trey Lance, I would say, yeah, keep three quarterbacks, develop those guys. But I think you can get DiNucci on the practice squad. I don't think he did anything in the preseason that you're kind of like, well, I mean, we're going to lose that guy on waivers and we can't lose him. You know, that's just kind of the reality of where things are. And I'd say, Cody, you and I should be the first ones to make this joke that's, made every single year. Like breaking news, Russell Wilson has made the Broncos 53-man roster. And we'll do that for Pat Surtain later as well. Can't wait to see all your hilarious tweets, all of you who copy that joke every single year. But in all seriousness, I am thinking two quarterbacks now. What do the Broncos do beyond keeping two quarterbacks? Because we've talked about, could it be 5 wide receivers or up to 7 wide receivers? Could it be 3 tight ends or 4 tight ends, maybe 5? I don't know. I mean, this is where things get really, really interesting from here is once you keep just 2 quarterbacks, I know it's only one spot, but it kind of feels like it gives you major flexibility elsewhere on the roster.
And then you and I were obviously in agreement in terms of 3 running backs, Javonte Williams, Samaje Perine, Jaleel McLaughlin. It was never in question. These are the 3 backs that we have on ours. And hey, as we're sharing our 53-man roster picks, our player picks, make sure you share with us on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast if you're listening or watching your thoughts as we go along. But now let's get to fullback here. Fullback is important here in Sean Payton's offense, especially an extension of the run game. Obviously, I've got them keeping veteran Michael Burton. Are you in agreement with me or do you have something different here?
I'm going to go against the grain on this one just because I think, it was fascinating to me that Michael Burton played a lot in that final preseason game. I kind of wondered why, and Mike Kliss pointed out during the broadcast, well, he's the only fullback on the roster, but I mean, I don't know, maybe Nate Adkins, maybe this is where he makes the team. And I think he's still a bit more of a long shot. I would almost go like 51-49 or 49-51, depending on which way you look at it in terms of him making the team. But I know Mike Kliss had him making the team as a tight end. We didn't really see him do a ton of straight fullback work, but maybe the Broncos didn't want him to do that for fear of, remember the Saints and Sean Payton a couple years ago, they stole a fullback from the Broncos who looked pretty darn good in the preseason.
Yep.
Was that Prentice or something like that?
Yeah.
Adam Prentice, maybe. So they stole a fullback from the Broncos, and it's like, hey, Sean Payton's like, I'm not putting that out there on tape. I already know what he can do from what we see in practices. So maybe this is the inroad for Nate Adkins, who I think had a really impressive, as you called it back at OTAs, Cody. Maybe this is the inroad for him to get on the 53.
All right. Certainly interesting. Add some wrinkle to the conversation here. Well, now let's go to the tight end because this kind of impacts it as well. I've got them keeping 4 tight ends. I've got them keeping Adam Troutman, Greg Dulcich, Chris Manhertz, mainly as an extension, as an extra offensive lineman and a guy who, if you need to, can catch some passes for you, extra blocking help. And, of course, Albert Okwuegbunam, who I felt like deserves to be on the 53-man roster. I mean, all his teammates on Saturday, when media started walking in the locker room, they're like, Albert, like that. That's a cool thing. Like, these guys were genuinely happy for him. I've got these 4 tight ends on my roster. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And then, hey, we got to get into the conversation of wide receivers afterward.
Well, I completely agree with these 4 tight ends, Cody, and we already warned people. If the Broncos cut or trade Albert O, we're going to have an absolute just fiery episode of this podcast eventually. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope we don't need to have it. I hope it can be left unsaid. So I think that the wide receiver position, though, is where things are really fascinating for me. Obviously, Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, Marvin Mims, those guys are going to be on the final 53. As of this point in time, we expect Brandon Johnson also to be on the final 53. Kind of seemed like he ascended into that wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 role after Tim Patrick went down. But the 5th and 6th, if any, those spots, that really right now is where I'm kind of, I guess, not confused. I'm just interested to see what the Broncos do, because Lil Jordan Humphrey to me is the 5th guy, and I think you and I are in agreement on that as of what we saw. And I don't know that it's necessarily like, oh man, he was so good, he has to be 5th. It was kind of just like, well, I mean, he was kind of the best of the rest of the guys. But I agree with what you have here on this list, Cody. Only 5 wide receivers for now. I think the Broncos are going to be active pursuing waivers, maybe trades, to try to get a wide receiver on this roster that can contribute. I just don't know. I don't think the Kendall Hintons of the world are making this 53. Marquez Callaway, I don't think he did anything worthy of making the 53. So I think kind of a surprise twist. You and I both have 5 wide receivers on our 53 right now.
Well, and we're also in agreement, too, on the offensive line, interior, exterior. Let's go over this. Offensive tackle, we've got 4. We've got Garrett Bowles, Mike McGlinchey, Cam Fleming, Alex Pocheski being some options there. And our interior offensive lineman, Cush at center, Powers obviously at guard, Miners at guard, and Quinn Bailey, I thought has had a hell of it under the radar training camp. Once again, a guy who's been on the roster since 2019, staying on as a guy who can play guard, can play tackle, might even be able to play a little bit of center for you as well. So you have your swing options there. That gives the Broncos 23 players on the offensive side of the ball. So if you're good at doing math in terms of 53, that means that Denver's going to have more defensive players than they do offensive players. But there's a rhyme and a reason behind that. And we're going to tell you on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at Underdog Fantasy. It's the easiest place to play fantasy football, and it's the best place for Best Ball Mania. Best Ball Mania 4 is the largest fantasy football tournament ever. And August is here. September is fast approaching, and you know what that means. The official start of fantasy football drafting month has began. Get championship ready for your home league by trying out Best Ball on Underdog Fantasy. All you do is one live snake draft. There's no waivers, no trades, and Underdog sets your best lineup every single week. Try it out with Underdog's Best Ball Mania tournament, the largest fantasy football contest of all time. It's back, and it's even bigger with $15 million of total prizes that are up for grabs, including an absurd $3 million going to whoever wins it. Last year, the winner drafted their team in July, so don't wait around. Get started today. Visit UnderdogFantasy.com or find them in the App Store and sign up with promo code LOCKEDON to get your first deposit doubled up to $100. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code LOCKEDON, all in one word. Get there today and win the Best Ball Mania tournament.
How do we project the 53-man roster for the Denver Broncos on the defensive side of the ball? As Cody teased a little bit ago, more defensive players on this projection here than offensive players. But who's making it? Who's maybe some surprises on this list, and who are your picks? Let us know, especially, hey, for we got to stop, Cody, and we got to pause the show for a second and give a shout out to our everydayers out there. I mean, shout out, mile high salute to every single one of you that listen to the show every day. You engage with the show. Hey, we just about made it, baby. We're almost to September, which means we're almost to the regular season officially. The preseason is already in the rear view. Rosters are being set, and we're going to cover every single angle. So thanks for joining the show. You know, you can find us free and available everywhere that you listen to podcasts, as well as you can watch us on YouTube. So wherever we're joining you, whether it's on the couch, whether it's on the treadmill, at the store, in the car, we appreciate you so much for making us part of your day and for making us your first listen of the day every single day. We love getting to do this together with you. And Cody, we got to talk about the defense. There's a lot to talk about here.
Oof.
27 players projected on this side of the ball in this 53-man roster. And I think you and I, we have some thoughts at each of these. Like you said, there's a rhyme and reason to each of these picks. Hit me with the defensive backfield, though. First, let's start at the cornerback position. Who's making this roster?
Yeah, this one was a little tough at first when I was trying to think of the other positions because we know Riley Moss is dealing with the core muscle surgery. And I've always said, like, hey, I wouldn't be shocked if he's the guy who, week one, the roster cuts happen and then he gets placed on short-term IR just so it allows, another roster spot while he works his way back into football shape. But cornerback-wise, I've got Surtain and Mathis. Breaking news on that front. Asang Bassi, his strong preseason performance, core 4 special teams value. That's big. Jaquan McMillan, also a guy who could play inside, outside, and also play on special teams. We got Riley Moss on it because obviously by default, he's a draft pick. He's a guy that they want to see take the next step as he recovers. And then I've got K'Wan Williams on mine. Now, Sayre, when you look at cornerback, is there anything that maybe you'd add or do differently? What is your outlook there?
Well, if K'Wan Williams and Riley Moss, and I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Cody, if those guys both end up going to the temporary IR, that frees up a couple of spots there. And I don't know if Tremont Smith is going to be an initial 53-man roster guy. There's been some highly contested debates on that one. But if the Broncos do have to temporary IR guys like Riley Moss and K'Wan Williams, I think they're going to have to go to free agency or waivers once again at this position. I think you could make an argument at just about every position. The Broncos could potentially add players, or you could make a case that they should add somebody. Cornerback is one of those spots, though, that right now your 2 guys that you were planning on playing significant snaps could be starting the year on temporary IR, or at least could miss the first couple weeks of the season. Maybe the Broncos look to make some additions there.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. I mean, it's tough too, right? And we'll dive a little bit deeper into the Tremont Smith thing here. I've got a good theory on that. But also looking at maybe cornerback and how it impacts the rest of the defensive backfield. This was also tough. Like safety, I've got Justin Simmons, Caden Stearns, PJ Locke. I do have Kareem Jackson and Delarian Turner. Now, here's the reason why I have Kareem Jackson. I think this is the one that a lot of people in Broncos country are debating. For me, since Kareem Jackson didn't play in that third and final preseason game, and with PJ Locke still working his way back from that ankle injury, to me, it kind of says like, all right, hey, Jackson is a guy who's going to have to come back. Maybe he's going to have to play special teams at this point of his career. Or maybe he's just a guy that's just going to rotate in. But then I have Delarian Turner as well. I know we said in our post-game report, we didn't get to see too much of him in this game, but he might be one of those guys that, hey, as you mentioned too, if one of those 2 guys at cornerback go on injured reserve to start the season, maybe that allows for a guy like Turner to get called up here to be on the active roster. We'll see maybe how everything like that formulates. I think we're kind of in agreement on that. But outside linebacker is, I think, one of the more interesting ones here. And so far we have Jonathan Cooper and Randy Gregory, who we project to start. Nick Bonito, Frank Clark is the other 2 guys there. And then obviously Baron Browning by default. But I think the overall expectation is, hey, he's going to be on the PUP list to start the season, which, Sayre, that will open up, as we've talked about, a roster spot for somebody else as well. But these are the initial guys we have here. You agree? You disagree?
Yeah, I completely agree with this. As Baron Browning goes to the PUP, look, that leaves you with 4 guys off the edge. And I think the young players, Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, they're going to play bigger roles at the edge position this season for Denver. But you got to have a guy like, maybe it's an Aaron Patrick, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Maybe it's somebody from another team that you scout, your pro scouting department. They've got to do work. And I think I don't know that there's going to be an unsettled back end of this roster from the coaching staff and the front office point of view, but I do think we could see the Broncos be pretty active when it comes to waivers, especially key positions like edge and wide receiver and cornerback. So keep an eye on that, because right now I think there's only 4 spots that I would say are totally solid at this position group right now, but that could change. And obviously the Broncos know they'll get Baron Browning back eventually. Now, off-ball linebacker, I think maybe the most straightforward of the defense, Cody, when we talk about Alex Singleton, Josie Jewell, and then obviously Drew Sanders, the rookie, followed by Justin Cernat. They'll all play. Those guys will all be active on game days. But what about the defensive line? Do you think there's some still maybe, I don't know, confusion there, I guess you could say? Or do you think the Broncos are set with who they've got? Where do you have the D line right now?
Well, for me, and I'll give you the reason behind this. I've got them right now, I think, keeping 7 guys. So obviously, we know Mike Purcell was activated off the NFI list, made his return to practice. He's going to have to get into some football shape. Like, he hasn't participated at all in training camp. I know he's been doing conditioning stuff off on the side, but we talk about the physical fatigue that football causes, the contact in which where he plays specifically on the defensive line. I think it's going to take some time, and hopefully he's ready by week 1 to be where he needs to be. DJ Jones, obviously a roster lock, but he's also been a guy who's been banged up throughout the preseason. He was banged up a little bit last year, so that is a little bit of a question mark. We have Zach Allen on the roster, who's obviously no surprise considering the contract that he got, the impact that he has. I also have Matt Henningsen coming back into a role player type role. And now I've got Elijah Garcia on it as well. But there's also Jonathan Harris, who's a veteran guy. And my 7th guy that I've added here, and this is where I think it can be questionable. You can leave it up for discussion for any other position, maybe free up this space. I have them keeping Tyler Lancaster on the roster. I know you don't have him on yours initially here. The reason I have him here, Sayre, is because of Purcell working his way back, and obviously DJ Jones dealing with some injuries and being banged up a little bit. I felt like Lancaster's been solid at times, but he's not a guy that you want to start for the entire season. That would not be ideal for Denver. But I think you do need a little bit of an insurance policy here, specifically at nose tackle.
Yeah, you do, and that's where I'm kind of hoping they sneak him onto the practice squad. Maybe use that spot for the 53 on a wide receiver or something like that in waivers. Maybe another edge guy. We'll kind of have to wait to find out. But I don't mind that as far as having depth, and I don't mind the Broncos also seeking out additional depth on the D line. Like, I liked what Elijah Garcia did at times in the preseason, but I think the guys that were watching or were calling the game for 9 News with Steve Levy and Ryan Harris, a former Broncos offensive tackle. I think they were a little higher on Elijah Garcia's preseason than I was, and maybe just a little overhyped there, but I think he's safe for now. And I like what Mike Kliss said. I don't think he'd get through waivers. So if the Broncos buy his talent, that's worth it. And the production may come later. I think the talent was there. The splashes were there. The flash plays were there. So I think we have a pretty good idea right now of the top, like, 95-96% of these spots on offense and defense. It's going to be those final 2 or 3 on either side of the ball that kind of make the difference in whether or not you guys get through waivers and you're able to put in claims.
Well, with us rounding out and really taking care of everything, there's 3 other players we have to talk about that aren't on offense or defense, but you're specialists, right? So we had 27 on defense, 23 on offense. There's your 50 plus 3, which is Mitchell Fabroni at long snapper, Riley Dixon at punter, and I think Brett Maher has won the kicking job from what we have seen. There's your 53-man roster. But I think the one thing, too, is how do you build the practice squad? I asked Sean Payton a very insightful question on that following Saturday's game there. He gave me some good insight. And look, it's tough. With all the teams making roster cuts, we'll formulate some players in-house that we believe could make up the practice squad. Everything is interchangeable, by the way. And you're going to get that on today's episode. Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at Gametime. And the Gametime app is perfect for you if you're buying tickets to your favorite events. And you know what? If buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Gametime eliminates that from your headspace. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events that are near you. They also have flash deals and last-minute tickets, easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event in your area. Plus, you get images of your seats from your view in which you'll be attending the event. You can see exactly what your vantage point will be before you go. They also have the lowest price guarantee. They have event cancellation protection, job loss protection, and more. Gametime is the place for last-minute ticket deals. Forget planning months in advance. Gametime has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And the Gametime guarantee means that you'll always get the best price. And if you find tickets in the same section and roll for less, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. So snag the tickets without the stress with Gametime today. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, we are building our practice squad mainly from in-house players because the outside is so unknown right now. But just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day every single day, wherever you get your podcasts, or if you're watching us on YouTube. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. Broncos Country, you make this show exactly what it is. This show is for you, by you, and everything else. So thank you so much for making us part of your daily routine. Sayre, I think building the practice squad and formulating it's kind of tough in your head because we all know that the Broncos are going to be looking at other teams' players on the waiver wire. Particularly the Broncos are 5th in the waiver wire order, which gives them a really great opportunity to put some claims in. But because that's so hard to project, stick with some in-house guys. If we had to formulate a 16-man roster with some in-house guys that aren't going to make the active roster, let's talk about wide receiver here. Who do you have on there? Because for me, I've got Taylor Grimes and I have Kendall Hinton on the practice squad. And I want to remind Broncos fans, last year, Kendall didn't make the 53-man roster. He got waived and he got brought back onto the practice squad. I think sometimes that gets forgotten here, but I've got at least those two guys on the 16-man practice squad. Is there anybody else that you feel like should be added that is an in-house guy right now?
I think you could look at Marquez Callaway if Sean Payton really likes his projection in the offense. I don't think we saw it. So I think practice squad is the ideal spot. A lot of people had put his name in Sharpie as a roster lock after what he did in 2021 with the New Orleans Saints, but we didn't see that last year. And obviously we were kind of banking on, well, it must have just been because Sean Payton wasn't there. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Obviously, we didn't see anything in the preseason, not much in training camp from Callaway. So I guess I'm not necessarily banking on that, but I think practice squad would be fine for him unless the Broncos find other alternatives. Maybe they like this Josh Hammond guy quite a bit. So we'll kind of see. But I guess at the wide receiver spot, you always like to have a few on the practice squad. Now, running back, what about Tyler Beatty there for the practice squad? I think that would be kind of an ideal situation after Jaleel McLaughlin's breakout. Tyler Beatty sneaking onto the practice squad could be kind of a nice little ace in the sleeve, I guess, for the Denver Broncos later in the year.
Yeah, I like it too. And look, I think it maybe helps because Beatty, he only had, I think, 2 preseason games. The first one, and obviously missed the second one due to the injury, and was able to participate in the second half on this one. I think had some explosive runs. Felt like Dwayne Washington made a strong case for himself. But I'm with you. I've got Beatty on that. And then I even went with even adding Nate Adkins there. If he doesn't make the 53 as a fullback, then I've got him here, in which that gives us 5 total players right now on the practice squad from the in-house perspective. But let's take a look at the offensive line here. I've got Alex Forsyth because, look, you need another center option there. Maybe he can develop a little bit further. I've got Demontre Jacobs, even though we're still waiting to maybe hear the status on him. He got rolled up and left the game with an ankle injury. I don't think he returned. And I've got Hunter Byrd as a guy that you can develop a little bit on the practice squad. And these kind of make up the offensive line there. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is there anybody else you'd look at specifically on the O-line?
No, I love it. The 3 rookies, and Sean Payton talked about how much they like this undrafted rookie free agent class on the offensive line, which would be Alex Palczewski, who we talked about making the team earlier. Now you talk about Demontre Jacobs, Hunter Byrd, or Henry Byrd, excuse me. And then you've obviously got Alex Forsyth there as the center, the player who can come in and develop, like you said, hopefully eventually flex into. I just am not a huge fan of guys that only play one spot. So need to see him play some guard as well and maybe just ramp up that positional versatility. Now, I might see if Luke Wattenberg, I don't know, is he kind of done? That's kind of where we're at with him, the 5th round pick from 2022. George Payton trading up to go get him. Was that a Butch Berry banging the table for the guy, or was that the scouting department banging the table for the guy? I guess we'll find out with Luke Wattenberg. Yeah, was it Hackett? Did Hackett really like him? And it's one of those things where I wouldn't be surprised either way. I don't think I saw him get thrown around actually quite a bit in that game against the Rams. So kind of unfortunate. And then kind of rounding out offense, quarterback Ben DiNucci, you'd love to have him back on the practice squad as well. And I think the Broncos will try to do that if they can sneak him through waivers. But Cody, what about defensively? This is where you could see maybe some notable names, maybe some veterans get added on the defensive side of the ball who could maybe have early game day roles, even though they're on the practice squad.
Yeah, I mean, with all the players we've talked about so far, that's 9. And I made a mistake. I called him Hunter Bird. It's Henry Bird. That's my
I said it
apologies.
too.
I
said it
know that
too.
I put it in the show script like that. So that's on me, folks. See, I'm human. I get things wrong sometimes.
All right.
It's because I used to coach a kid. His name was Hunter Bird. So maybe that's why it stuck in my head
That's
a
it.
little bit there. Aside from
That's
that, defensively, cornerback, we talked about him a little bit earlier, maybe making a case for the 53. I've got them keeping 2 guys. I've got them keeping Fabian Moreau, veteran guy who they brought in because Tremont wasn't really showing anything in preseason or training camp at corner specifically. But I do have Tremont as one of those veteran guys that is on the practice squad because you can bring him up if you need him, if you need some help at the cornerback position, or mainly if you want to just have him as your guy on special teams, gunner. Like if Asang Bassi is playing and starting in the nickel, maybe you need to bring a guy like him and call him up on game day just because you might need him to play the role where Bassi usually does in some special teams because he's got a bigger workload on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, these are all things that went into my thinking and factoring in. And I'm going to go with Devon Key at safety. I felt like I was actually pretty impressed with him these last couple of games. I think he comes up against the run. He plays very aggressive. I think he could be a good special teams player in development here. And when Sean Payton did tell me this as well, he said, you have to look at when you're building your practice squad, it's not new. We talk about vision for the 53, but it's like, do these guys on our practice squad have the ability to start and develop on this team at some point? And that's really going to factor into it here for them. So something to keep an eye on. Austin Ajaki at linebacker, I feel like with his size and athleticism, he could be a solid player to have on your practice squad. I've got outside linebacker. I've got Aaron Patrick and Marcus Haynes, or it could be Thomas Incoom. If we're talking about in-house guys, I think Patrick is obviously a guy who Denver really values here, be a practice squad guy. And I feel like it could be on the defensive line. It could be this guy or this guy. I've got Jordan Jackson or Tomasi Lalil, the defensive lineman they acquired from the San Francisco 49ers early on in the week. He was number 61. I hope I pronounced his name the correct way. If not, that's apologies on my behalf there. But that would make up my 16-man practice squad, a couple of either ors when we look at it. Don't say anything to Adam Schefter. He's never seen a slash or an or on a depth chart, but we're going to do it here on the practice squad. How do you feel about any of those picks there?
You know, Cody, the one guy that I'm going to try to get on there some way, somehow is probably JL Skinner. I guess we left him off the
Totally
53
forgot about
and
him. My
he
bad.
would be, that's all right. You know, I don't think he really did much in the preseason to kind of say like, oh my gosh, JL Skinner, like on special teams, we need him to make an impact. On defense, he had a couple hits here and there, but I think people really like his, draft scouting report more so than what we saw in the preseason. And yes, he did show up a couple times, and yes, there is talent projection to be had there. So I would probably try to get him on the practice squad. But at the end of the day, folks, like, we've talked about JL Skinner just about as much as any other draft pick, meaning like people want to know about him. People are very intrigued by him. They like his projection a lot. But the reality is, like, he was a 6th round pick. This is not, this is a similar situation to, remember a couple of years ago, the Broncos draft Jamar Johnson out of Indiana in the 5th round.
Yeah.
Before, didn't they take him before Caden Stearns or a couple picks after? And people liked the Jamar. I think they took him after Stearns, but people liked the Jamar Johnson pick way more because the draft, experts are saying, well, Jamar Johnson is a better prospect. He should have gone in the 3rd or 4th round. Well, we've seen how that's turned out. So I'm just saying, don't be married to this idea that JL Skinner is some roster lock who is untouchable. Like, I don't think that's necessarily the case. He was a 6th round pick. We needed to see him show up in the preseason. I don't have anything in my notes, Cody, about JL Skinner popping off the tape. So I think practice squad is a good spot for him to continue to grow and develop.
I'm not opposed to that. And look, I made a refinement here. I removed one of the outside linebackers because if we do include Skinner, this is what the 16-man practice squad would look like. Marquez Callaway, Kendall Hinton, Taylor Grimes, Tyler Beatty, Nate Adkins, Forsyth, Demontre Jacobs, Henry Bird, Tremont Smith, Fabian Moreau, Devon Key, JL Skinner, Ben DiNucci, Austin Ajaki, Jordan Jackson, and Aaron Patrick. And obviously, folks, I mean, this is tough to project the practice squad, but we're looking at in-house guys here. I imagine there will be some non-familiar names that have not been in the Broncos building that will be on the practice squad come earlier this week. And as the roster news happens, once the 53-man roster is finalized, we'll share our thoughts and we'll talk about, did the Broncos get it right here? Did they get it wrong? And you can expect that all on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.